Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for 5 books. I Who've Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman, Belgian author. This is translated by Ros Schwartz. Eliza Clark, Penance. Wiles, Care of Wooden Floors. Elizabeth Mavor, A Green Equinox. And finally some poetry, Chinese poetry, 100 poems from the Chinese, collated and curated by the American poet Kenneth Rexroth. So I'm going to start with the Jacqueline Harpman. This is recommended to me by Anne Novella, and a very good recommendation it is too. So it starts with 40 women are in a cage as prisoners, and they are guarded by these men who refuse them any interaction. We don't know where this is, we don't know what time, what epoch this is, we don't know why they're there, we don't know what's required of them because they're never taken out and interrogated or made to work or anything. They're just simply existing in this cage. And the youngest of them is the heroine of this story. She's considerably younger. She basically was a child in there, grew up in there, so it sort of has vibes of the book Room by Emma Donoghue, that she has no experience outside of this cage, whereas the other women, you know, they were snatched from whatever their previous life was, and can barely remember and recall what that life was like because they've been here for so long. And an alarm goes off, a siren goes off, just as the sort of small opening is to provide their food is open, and the heroine manages to, all the guards run away, and the heroine manages to sort of slide out and release them all, so they're free. But they don't know what's out there. The guards are completely scarpered, so they emerge to, or particularly the girl leads them because she's the bravest and most curious. She leads them outside, where it's basically, it's not a desert in terms of temperature and everything, but there's nothing sort of visible really. But where, they go back and investigate outside of the cage, the building, and they find supplies and food and all that stuff, and no trace of the guards. So they're about to set up basically their own community outside. And before I go into, so that's the sort of second section of the book, and before I go into that, there's an introduction to this by the writer Sophie Mackintosh, who wrote the Water Cure. Now I haven't read it, but it sounds very, very heavily influenced by this, so it's highly surprising that she does the introduction to this. And the reason I never picked up Sophie Mackintosh's book, because it sounded really cruel. It sounded like the abasement of women. I think from what I can tell, they're these women, snatched and kept captive. We don't know where, why, all that, similar to the setup here. But the difference between this book and what I imagined and what put me off picking up Sophie Mackintosh is there's great humanity and dignity to the people here. And I didn't get the sense that in Mackintosh's there was the same. Maybe I'm being unfair to her because I haven't read it. So they set up this community, having sort of, walked to see what's outside, and the only thing they ever come across is exactly the same sort of establishments and institutions as they've escaped from. There are cages in there, and all the occupants are dead because they basically have been starved to death because they couldn't escape once the guards had fled. And the equipment and the food supplies are basically the same. So they go from sort of base to base to base, finding exactly the same, although the only difference is in some of the cages it's 40 men rather than 40 women. So eventually they realise that sort of, they can do this forever and nothing's going to change. They're not going to find anything. They're not going to find out about their, where they are. So they set up a community and they sort of start building shelters and stuff. And the girl is the most... she leads this, she drives this, and it's really interesting because she has no skills, because as I say, she grew up in the cage, she was exposed to nowhere, so she is learning about all these basic things such as building and all that sort of thing, but she does it, and she leads it for the whole community. But I think that was really well done, the fact that she hasn't been exposed to these things, but she's such a great character, and she's so bold and sort of takes risks, that she sort of works out how to do these things. But gradually, the women with her, they start dying just because they've hit old age, and she realises that they can't keep moving. This is why they've set up the community. They can't keep moving on because some of them are too frail to do it, and she's nagged at by they have settled into domesticity, whereas she's an explorer, she's an adventurer, but for the sake and the humanity of her fellow women, she stays there in this sort of domestic environment until eventually, and this is the end of part 2, the last of them has died, so she's on her own now. She has no responsibilities, no ties. So then she goes on her exploration of the rest of this place. Is it even Earth? We're not, the women aren't even sure that the constellations of the stars are the same when they look up. And so we go into part 3, which sort of has the vibes of David Marks and Wittgenstein's Mistress, where she's the last surviving person on this planet. And it ends with her, she reaches old age, and it ends with her sort of finding this sort of rather palatial building where presumably the governor or whoever ruled over this planet was sighted, and she sort of retires to this unoccupied palace. But as I say, I think it's quite a basic book in that it's looking at basic humanity of, we live, we grow old, we die. What do we do with that? There's very limited what they're able to do because, they have been prisoners and they have very limited resources. And yet they form a community of love and support, and the way they treat each other, that when people die, there's great dignity, there's a great humanity about it. So, I was sort of, taken with this book. I gave it, I think, 4.5 stars. And on to Eliza Clark, Penance. So this is a book about sort of true crime, but not. It is about the crime at the heart of this. Now, whether I think it's based or a melange of several crimes, mainly from America. This is set in the UK, but it's really about how our attitudes to true crime is an form of entertainment. So the crime is that 3 schoolgirls kidnap, torture, and end up murdering and setting fire to the corpse of a 4th of their schoolgirls. And a sort of 50-year-old seedy journalist who's sort of fallen out of favour because he was caught up in the phone hacking scandal. I can explain what that is if anyone's not sure, and ask me in the comments, but look it up. It was a huge intrusion on privacy by the press in the UK, and a huge scandal, and actually caused some newspapers to close down. It was so bad. So he's been swept up in that and is sort of trying to re-emerge by sort of writing about true crime, and he sniffs out this story through online, through sleuthers and fandom groups. And so he goes to this town, which is a sort of decaying seaside town in the north of England, and is trying to winkle out the story about how it got to such a phase. And the book is structured as sort of interviews with the people, with a few sort of quoted of sort of true crime blogs and the irreverence with which sort of certain podcasters treat the subject. And what lies behind it is typical Glee meets Columbine kind of mentality, if you can imagine that. We've got sort of burgeoning sexuality and sexual jealousies. We've got bullying. We've got abusive upbringings. We've got the shift in sort of school school friend group allegiances. All these are sort of involved, but they're not. You never really get to the heart of it. And because one of the themes is the occult, that these girls sort of dabble, or some of the girls involved dabble in the occult, and the town itself, basically, its only livelihood now that sort of tourism has dropped off a cliff, is it's sort of got this ghost history going back to the Viking Age, but also one of their friends died in a water theme park, was sort of drowned by an accident. So for all these sort of embroidered myths about ghosts and hauntings, there is still a dead body somewhere along the line at the heart of it. And now, of course, we've got this dead body of the girl who's been murdered by her 3 school peers. However, that's what it is. But I found it really quite unsatisfactory, mainly because of how it was structured. I didn't feel there were any plot lines that were nailed. They all seemed, as I say, a bit sort of vague and woolly. I didn't think there were any sort of interesting character insights. For example, one of the 3 killers, we get towards the end of the book an interview with her older sister about what she was like growing up. And I just felt that didn't add anything to our understanding of these girls. And then I began to think, well, that's the point of this book. That in the same way as sort of myths are embroidered from sort of true life fragments of events in history, such as a Viking, king who assassinated people in a certain way, or witches and all this sort of stuff. You get this sort of huge sort of fictional storytelling evolving, and in a way that's what this crime amounts to. That yes, there's the hard, undeniable material truth of a girl died at the end of it, but trying to sort of get into how we ended up there is just myth and embellishment. Now, is it myth and embellishment by the likes of the bloggers and the sleuthers and the author who is purportedly the journalist who's tracking down this story? And I think this book is very much in conversation with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which I've never read, but I do know is true crime with great literary embellishment. And you arrive there with this book as well, in that the very end, and I don't think this is a spoiler, but if it is, you might want to mute me at this point, where the seedy 50-year-old journalist has published a book called Penance, i.e. this book that you're reading, but has fallen foul of a controversy in how he elicited the information, that he embroidered the truth, he misled the people he was interviewing, and his publishers pulled the book. And so the first question is, well, how come I'm reading this book? I mean, obviously it's a book within a book within a book, or metafiction, or whatever you want to call it, but that mechanism didn't work for me. And then the very final section is this disgraced author, come journalist, is being interviewed by a Guardian journalist. And the Guardian, if you don't know, in the UK, is the sort of the left-leaning intellectual newspaper. It's not a tabloid; it's a serious newspaper, but it's pretty much the only one on the left. And she's grilling him on his lack of morals and ethics and standards. That he paid everybody that he interviewed, which he says, well, that's a positive. I wasn't trying to cheat them if I was paying them. But it has to feel very much of a lecture by the author, by Eliza Clark, in the form of this Guardian journalist, that we are complicit, that we make true crime into an entertainment, which is exactly what she's done in this book, even if she's trying to warn us off doing just that. It doesn't work. The whole structure of it, for me, does not work. And I felt a bit lectured by a sort of a school teacher by that very end section. I mean, I agree. True crime is not an entertainment, but has become a huge entertainment industry through podcasts, through sleuthers, through fandom, and people sort of writing fan fiction. This book, in a way, is a kind of fan fiction of these 3 teenage killers. So it just seemed very muddled to me. And the other thing is, it's not literary. It may have pretensions to be in dialogue with Truman Capote, but it's not literary. So the plot isn't doing anything for me, and I knew that we weren't, by about halfway, I knew we weren't going to get resolution here. I knew this was going to shine no useful light on what lay behind this crime. So the plot isn't propelling me. The characters, in the same way, I knew we wouldn't get to the hub of them, but also the language. These are teenage girls. So the language isn't propulsive. There's very little to carry you through this book, and this is where I think it's the man-bite-dog mechanism that she's seeking, that sort of great film, which I do recommend, where film directors are following a serial killer around, and gradually they get sucked more and more into being complicit with him, and he sort of turns the camera on them and invite them to do one of his killings. And I think she's trying to make us feel guilty for being interested in true crime. But again, there's a hypocrisy about that because this, she's written this book in the first place. So I just don't think that mechanism works. It's not, I wasn't sucked into this at all. I was kept outside of it because the language was dull, the structure was dull, and I felt that we weren't going to get anywhere, and indeed we didn't. Some of the parts in themselves are interesting. So all the ghost stuff, I just, I glazed over. Whereas all the stuff about the fan blogs of murderers and serial killers, like the Columbine killers, and there's a couple here fictionalised, but obviously a sort of Harrison Klebold type, and all the people who get sucked into sort of writing fan fiction. I thought that was enlightening, and I did sort of get something out of that. And I also felt the generation gap, because she took me through all the different mechanisms and platforms and language and jargon and acronyms involved in the online world, which is just something that's, I missed out on probably because of my age. So I did find them enlightening, but the parts did not add up to a whole, I'm afraid. 2 stars. And onto Wiles, Care of Wooden Floors. So for me, after the generation of people like Ishiguro, Julian Barnes, Graham Swift, what's his name? I can't remember, who died recently, which is shocking of me, but I've got a temporary nominal asphasia. He wrote Rachel Papers and Money and things like that. And Martin Amis, sorry. After that generation, Ian McEwan, another one, the next sort of generation of British writers, I would put Wiles definitely amongst the top of them. I really enjoy his work. This is his debut novel, so I've read backwards. I read Plume, which is his latest, came out a couple of years ago. Then I read The Way In this year, and I'll post my review of that. And then this. They're all great reads, and what Wiles is supreme about is his sort of description of urban space. There are very few writers I've come across who do it as well as him. So to give you an example, I will tell you about what this book is and where it's set, but I just wanted to read this. There's some tremendous descriptive writing here. An Eastern church erupted from a square bisected by the boulevard, a heavy castellated cube covered in antiseptically white plaster that seemed pulled in tight to every angle and leading edge, a starched bedsheet tucked impossibly tight by some psychotic matron, surmounted by a fungal mass of time-green copper domes, generous, almost Catholic, gilt glinted through the rain miasma, and even in the grim light the whitewash shone in a way that suggested it was producing its own energy, throwing off a kind of Cherenkov radiation into the cooling tank of the city. It was possibly ancient, but so perfectly maintained that it might as well have been built yesterday, a fresh cube of tofu swimming in the city's murky tetsu broth. I love that. And just a one-liner for talking about the sky. The peculiarity of their illumination was a matter of contrast, owing to the abrupt, unheralded darkness of the sky behind them, which had turned an intense slate grey, pregnant with blue and purple tones, an embolism of a sky, a dam behind which unimaginable pressure had built. So, a guy is asked by a friend of his, who is a pretty famous music composer and conductor, who is going to Los Angeles, but not to play his music. This friend has asked him to look after his flat in an unnamed Eastern European city, Prague, Bucharest, who knows? But that's what it said to me, one of those 2 cities. And this pianist and conductor, he very much has OCD, so his flat is immaculate and has these sort of made to measure, very expensive wooden floors. And he says to his friend, look, please look after it, don't let my cats on the leather sofa, don't, please, if you spill anything on the floor, come and phone me any time of the day or night in LA and I'll tell you what to do. But otherwise, enjoy yourself. And it turns out that this guy is going to LA because his American wife is back over there and is going to divorce him. And of course, it's a book about sort of increasing sort of chaos and entropy as indeed the cats do go on the sofa and scratch the leather. He does spill wine on the floor and tries to get the stain out, and he makes it worse. One of the cats dies walking on the piano, which should never be opened, but he'd had it opened, and the cat accidentally got, the lid fell on the cat and killed it. He tries to hide the cat in the sort of the rubbish chute that feeds all the apartments. Next day, the cat is returned to him by the janitor, who's not having any of it. So there's sort of increasing acceleration of this sort of, everything falling apart. Quite comical. And eventually he has to get in touch with his friend, because he can no longer restore the flat. He's almost trashed it. He's certainly reduced it from its, heightened purity, which is, as I say, very important to the guy with OCD, because it sort of represents his sort of mental well-being, to have this sort of spick and span, Spartan and quite antiseptic flat. And I won't, because of spoilers, I won't tell you what the friends over in America's response was, but it's not what either he or I was expecting. I felt it was a bit glib, actually, but, didn't spoil the novel for me. So I felt it, it is a debut novel. I felt it was more modest in scope and didn't have the insights that his two subsequent books do, where they really delve into space, not just as descriptive metaphor, but actually to make us think about space and time and energy and all this sort of stuff in quite profound ways, I feel, particularly Plume, and the nature of change and transition and mutation of cities. But this is a highly enjoyable read, 4-star. And on to Elizabeth Mavor, A Green Equinox. So this is published by Virago Modern Classics, and I'm not quite sure, but I saw someone talking about it on Twitter, and I thought it was the publishers talking about it, but I hadn't heard of the author, I hadn't heard of the book, so I thought, I looked up the blurb, I said, oh, that sounds interesting, and I bought it, and I was absolutely charmed by this book. It's a character-driven study, but also a study of its times, which I reckon is the sort of late 40s, early 50s of the UK, where things are just beginning to change in terms of emerging from the war and rationing, but also people's morals, the sort of declining of the aristocracy that happened after, because of the First World War, and so many of them were killed in the officer classes, is sort of continued, by the Second World War. But this book is basically, the heroine is called Hero, ironically, and she is in an affair with a guy called Hugo, or Hugh, I can't remember which. And the reason that they have got together is because both of them don't like the modern world. That Hugo takes refuge in sort of historical study of the Rococo period, and is in charge of Britain's premier Rococo collation of artefacts. And he prefers to sort of reside in there and escape from the modern world. He's against change, he's fearful of change. And she's an antiquarian a bookseller, has a bookshop in the town. And she too feels more comfortably in the status quo, the way things are, that she doesn't like change. And yet they're still, I think even then, still quite a radical act in having an affair. They're effectively being a ménage à trois with his wife, who at that point, the book opens, even though it's quite, it's not a big town, but she's never really met his wife. And his wife is the absolute opposite of the two of them. That even though she's quite plain and mumsy, and is the mother of 2 children, she's a political radical. She's, organising local meetings and demonstrations and picket lines where a sort of community tree is going to be cut down, and they do that thing of draping themselves around the tree and building a tree house. It's a quite modern ideas, but this is back in the 40s and 50s. And yet she's very mumsy about it, It's radical actions, but very sort of kind of practical, community caring approach to it. Anyway, somehow the antiquarian bookseller gets dragged along on one of these things. She was going to a meeting, and then the subject of of the meeting change because of this emergency of this tree suddenly being, threatened. And she finally meets this wife, and there's something about her that she's drawn to, and she starts an affair with her without obviously telling the husband. So now we have a genuine menage a trois, but there's no apex of it, whereby normally there's one character is basically sleeping with both the other two. Here, they're all sleeping with each other. So it's quite an interesting take on the menage a trois. It's a collapse of the menage a trois triangle, as it were, because, as I say, there's no apex of it. And she's driving with her friend in a car, and they have a crash, and they both end up in hospital. And they're kicked out of the hospital because there's an outbreak of typhoid or typhus in the area due to a tin of meat which has become contaminated, and the vector is in their local area. And they both go to recover in the male lover's, his mother's, where she lives. Now she is someone, again, ahead of her time. She's very involved in ecological work. She's made this sort of garden out of a reclaimed sort of lime pit, a quarry. But unfortunately, while they're there, it comes out that she's been having this affair with her husband. So the wife storms off and abandons both the husband and her own lesbian mistress. And now our hero becomes drawn to the mother-in-law. And she is someone who's clearly attracted very easily. And it reminded me of the Terence Stamp movie by Pasolini called Theorem. Only there, this guy seduces one by one a family of four, the mother, father, son and daughter. Terence Stamp is the person who seduces them each in turn, but he's very much the devil. Here it's much softer, it's much lighter, there's no darkness. It's really a reflection of her weakness, that she falls in love very easily, but in a very fluid, she has no set type of gender or age or anything. And it's much more gentle, and there's something really pleasing about the way this is written, the way it's executed. I sort of fell in love with this book, even though I'm not really into books that are only about relationships. I mean, it was about a bit more than relationships, because it's also about this thing about radical change versus conservative preservation of tradition. So there is more to it than that, but it's mainly about the relationships. I always like to think that a woman Potter did that. Oh, the two vaunted Greeks. Do you remember the horror of that barbarous Periclean funeral oration that everyone even now goes on about? So cruel, not a woman's voice to be heard in all that catalogue of slaughter. And it's true, because I remember doing the Pericles' funeral oration at school. So yeah, I was just sort of smitten by this book. 5 stars. And finally, 100 Poems for the Chinese. This book was sent to me by one of my subscribers, Mitchell Axler. And even though the poetry is from the 8th century and then from the 10th to 12th century, there's something it felt very modern. It's, sort of without descending into sort of, cliche, one really got the sense of the cosmos or the cosmic scale within this, the scale of nature. In this case, the nature in China. There's a lot of repeated motifs across different poets, of the sort of the landscape, and a lot of them are set against the backdrop of civil strife, as there's always battling going on for the control of China. Of the turning of the seasons and the turning of the year. The new year features a lot in here. A lot of the poets like a drink and wine or two. There's a lot of sort of self-admitted in the poem, I'm under the influence of. It was just, again, very pleasing. This is by a poet called Miao Yao Chen, who lost a wife and son young. And this is called Sorrow. Heaven took my wife. Now it has also taken my son. My eyes are not allowed a dry season. It is too much for my heart. I long for death. When the rain falls and enters the earth, when a pearl drops into the depths of the sea, you can dive in the sea and find the pearl. You can dig in the earth and find the water. But no one has ever come back from the underground springs. Once gone, life is over for good. My chest tightens against me. I have no one to turn to, nothing, not even a shadow in the mirror. They're very simple, these poems, but very elegant, very elegaic. And as I say, there's a lot about nature and stuff. Meanwhile, this is by a poet called Su Tung Po. Meanwhile, it is no greater accomplishment to be a rich corpse or a poor one. Jewels of jade and pearl are put in the mouths of the illustrious dead to conserve their bodies. They do them no good, but after 1,000 years they feed the robbers of the tombs. As for literature, it is its own reward. Fortunately, fools pay little attention to it. I really like that, the idea of grave robbers. Obviously they're attracted to shiny gems, stones and things like that, but they'd ignore any rich literature. So yeah, I read this in one sitting. It's about 144 pages, 100 poems, 4 stars. So there you have it. I shall be reading Kate Briggs's book, which sounds absolutely fascinating in a sort of pomo metafictional way. I also have Solenoid by Cartarescu to read. The reason that I haven't got down to that is because I've just started my second week of annual leave, because I've taken none really this year. I had lots to use up, so I took 2 weeks off, and I've started writing a new project, a new novel, last week. And so when I'm writing, it's hard to sort of fit in reading, because even if I want to sit back and relax and read, my mind is still whirring on dialogue or descriptive things. So I'm going to have to push the Cartarescu back probably till the Christmas break, and hopefully I can finish the first draft of this novel by then. So yeah, till next time. Thanks very much.